Two doctors swore oaths to do no harm, and then, on a November morning in 1941, destroyed a 23-year-old woman's mind while she recited the Lord's Prayer. This is not a medical history. This is a prosecution. The defendants, Dr. Walter Freeman, Dr. James Watts, and the patriarch who hired them, Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr. The charge: the deliberate, knowing destruction of Rosemary Kennedy. The evidence: their own words, their own records, their own choices. Let's begin. Before we can understand what these men did to Rosemary Kennedy, we need to understand who they were, what they'd already done, the pattern they'd established long before they ever touched her. Walter Jackson Freeman II was born in 1895 into medical royalty. His grandfather, William Williams Keene, had been one of the most celebrated surgeons in American history. Freeman studied at Yale, then the University of Pennsylvania, eventually securing a position at George Washington University as a neurologist, not a surgeon. A neurologist. That distinction matters enormously. Freeman couldn't legally cut into a patient's brain himself. The law required a licensed surgeon for that. So Freeman needed a partner, someone with the credentials to hold the scalpel while Freeman directed the destruction. He found James Watts. Watts had trained at some of the finest medical institutions in the country. He brought surgical credentials, technical precision, and, most importantly, the medical legitimacy that made the whole enterprise appear scientific, rather than barbaric. Their partnership began in 1936 at George Washington University, and from the start, the division of labor was clear. Freeman provided the evangelical energy, the crusade to make lobotomy America's answer to mental illness. Watts provided the blade. Freeman had witnessed the Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz perform a leucotomy in Europe. He became convinced that similar procedures could revolutionize American psychiatry. By the mid-1930s, Freeman had made lobotomy his professional mission, traveling to medical conferences, publishing papers, cultivating relationships with wealthy families who might provide patients, because that's what he needed. Patients, subjects, human beings whose brains he could cut in the name of progress. By 1941, Freeman and Watts had performed nearly 100 lobotomies, nearly 100 brains, nearly 100 people whose minds they had surgically altered and, in many cases, permanently destroyed. Their published papers tell a story. Every patient, according to Freeman and Watts, suffered from some form of mental disorder requiring the procedure. That language appeared consistently in their research. It was the justification, the scientific cover for what they were doing. And it would matter later enormously when historians began asking whether Rosemary Kennedy actually met that standard, or whether the doctors knew she didn't. The American Medical Association wasn't silent about lobotomy in 1941. This is crucial. In the spring and summer of that year, months before Rosemary's procedure, the AMA issued explicit warnings in its official publications. The language was stark. Lobotomy was too experimental. The side effects were too dramatic. Think about what those phrases mean in medical terms. Too experimental meant the procedure hadn't been adequately tested. The outcomes weren't predictable. Doctors performing lobotomies were essentially conducting experiments on their patients without the safeguards that should accompany experimental medicine. Too dramatic was a euphemism for catastrophic. The AMA was telling physicians that patients were emerging from these procedures fundamentally altered, not improved, altered, diminished, destroyed. Any physician who chose to read the AMA's journals would have encountered these warnings. They were published. They were available. They represented the official position of American medicine's most authoritative body. Freeman read them. Watts read them. They also knew, from their own case files, what the warnings meant in practice. They had patients who could no longer work after their procedures, patients who could no longer care for themselves, patients who had entered their operating room as functioning adults and emerged as permanent dependents. Some of their own published cases documented catastrophic outcomes they framed as acceptable trade-offs for the calming of difficult patients. The medical community was already raising questions. Critics within the profession were already warning that Freeman and Watts were moving too fast, claiming too much, and destroying minds in the name of convenience rather than cure. They kept cutting anyway. But the medical establishment's warnings weren't the only red flags these doctors ignored. Freeman and Watts were building a client base, and the clients they cultivated were wealthy families seeking permanent solutions to relatives they found difficult to manage. Not treatment, not recovery, permanent docility. That's who came to Freeman and Watts. Families who wanted their troublesome members made quiet. And in the fall of 1941, Joseph P. Kennedy, Sr. became one of those families. Now let's talk about the man who would hire them. Joe Kennedy didn't become a monster on the day he ordered his daughter's lobotomy. He'd been practicing for decades. The pattern was established long before Rosemary became inconvenient. The fortune that made the Kennedy dynasty possible was built through methods that would later be classified as securities fraud. In the unregulated stock market of the 1920s, Kennedy participated in stock pools, coordinated schemes where groups of investors artificially inflated share prices through wash trading before selling to unsuspecting buyers who didn't know the game was rigged. This wasn't speculation or rumor. The Libby Owens Ford stock pool of 1933 is documented. Kennedy helped organize a scheme using tactics the Securities and Exchange Commission would subsequently prohibit. The mechanism was elegant in its corruption. Insiders would trade shares among themselves to create the appearance of market interest, driving up the price, then dump their holdings on regular investors who believed they were buying into genuine momentum. The people who lost money on these schemes lost their savings, their retirements, their children's futures. Kennedy got richer. The punchline, and it really is darkly comic, is that Franklin Roosevelt appointed Kennedy to chair the newly created SEC in 1934. The man who knew all the tricks was hired to police them. Maybe that's true. But it also meant that Joe Kennedy faced no accountability for the methods that had made him wealthy enough to be useful to a president. His personal conduct matched his business ethics. Gloria Swanson was one of the biggest movie stars in Hollywood when she met Joe Kennedy. Their affair began when they discussed her career, and Kennedy moved quickly to gain power of attorney over her business affairs. He took control of her film productions. He inserted himself into every aspect of her professional and financial life. And he conducted the affair with audacity that bordered on contempt for discretion. Kennedy traveled with Swanson on vacations where his wife Rose was also present, the three of them together. Rose Kennedy, wife and mother of his children, sharing space with her husband's mistress while Joe Kennedy apparently felt no need to hide what he was doing. When the affair ended, when it no longer served Kennedy's interests, Swanson discovered her financial situation had deteriorated under his management. The man who had taken power of attorney over her affairs had not, it seemed, managed those affairs for her benefit. This was one documented affair. Biographers have identified several others. The pattern was consistent. Kennedy took what he wanted and moved on when he was finished. But it was his time as ambassador to the Court of St. James's that revealed the full catastrophe of Joe Kennedy's judgment. From 1938 to 1940, Kennedy represented the United States in Britain. Europe was lurching toward war. Nazi Germany had annexed Austria. Hitler's ambitions were becoming clear to anyone willing to see them. And Joe Kennedy's response was to support Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's appeasement policy, with enthusiasm that exceeded any diplomatic requirement. Kennedy repeatedly predicted British defeat. He expressed defeatist sentiments that infuriated Winston Churchill. He advocated for accommodation with fascism at precisely the moment when accommodation meant surrender. And he attempted, this is documented, to arrange meetings with Adolf Hitler himself. Whether Kennedy's motivations were economic calculation, political misjudgment, or something closer to ideological sympathy remains debated by historians. What's not debated is the outcome. Kennedy was recalled from his ambassadorship in 1940. His political career was finished. The positions he had publicly taken made him too toxic for public office. But his ambitions weren't finished. They simply transferred to his sons. Joe Kennedy would spend the rest of his life building a political dynasty through his male children, John, Robert, Ted. These sons would carry the Kennedy name into the White House, into the Senate, into the highest offices in American government. And his daughters? They were supposed to be assets, beautiful, accomplished ornaments to the Kennedy brand, supporting players in the rise of the Kennedy men. Rosemary was becoming a problem. Who was Rosemary Kennedy before they destroyed her? Rosemary Kennedy was born on September 13, 1918, the third child and eldest daughter of Joseph and Rose Kennedy. From early childhood, she exhibited developmental differences that her family noted with concern. She was slower to reach milestones than her siblings. She struggled in school. She required additional support for activities that came easily to the other Kennedy children. The nature of her condition has been debated by historians and medical experts who have examined the available evidence. Some believe she had an intellectual disability present from birth, possibly related to oxygen deprivation during delivery. Others have suggested her challenges were less severe than the family later acknowledged, that she was a slow learner, perhaps, rather than disabled. Here's what the record shows clearly. Rosemary Kennedy was capable of significant accomplishment despite whatever difficulties she faced. She kept diaries. Her handwriting was legible. Her thoughts were coherent. She wrote letters to her family, letters that survive, letters we can read, letters that demonstrate a mind engaged with the world around her. When her father served as ambassador to Britain, Rosemary traveled with the family. In 1938, she was presented at court before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. This was not a ceremonial nothing. Court presentations required participants to follow complex protocols, to curtsy properly, to comport themselves with the dignity the occasion demanded. Rosemary did this. Photographs from the event show a young woman in formal dress participating in one of the most prestigious social rituals of the era. She attended social functions. She engaged with the world. She was photographed with her siblings, participating in family activities like any of the other Kennedy children. She was not the severely disabled person the family would later claim she had always been. That narrative came after they needed to justify what they'd done. By 1940, Rosemary was living at a convent school in Washington, D.C., supervised by nuns. The family described her as exhibiting increasingly troublesome behavior. She was reportedly sneaking out at night. She experienced what they called mood swings and periods of agitation. What were the specific incidents that alarmed her father? The documentary record is frustratingly incomplete on this point. We don't know exactly what Rosemary did that convinced Joe Kennedy his daughter required drastic intervention. We know only that he concluded she required a permanent solution. Not treatment, not therapy, not medication for the mood disturbances the family described, not continued supervision at the convent school where she was already living safely under the care of religious sisters, trained in patience and support. A permanent solution. The timeline of Joe Kennedy's decision reveals something prosecutors would recognize immediately: consciousness of guilt. In the fall of 1941, Joe Kennedy consulted with doctors about Rosemary. But the documentary record does not show what we would expect from a loving father seeking help for a struggling child. It does not show extensive consultation with multiple physicians. It does not show careful consideration of alternative treatments. It does not show the deliberation that should accompany any decision to surgically alter a person's brain. What the record shows is Joe Kennedy approaching Freeman and Watts directly. The doctors, already known for producing permanently docile patients in America's most prominent families. The doctors whose specialty was not treatment or recovery, but permanent incapacitation. For Walter Freeman, a Kennedy patient represented an extraordinary professional opportunity. Documents from this period show that Freeman recognized what Rosemary represented: a rare chance to perform his signature procedure on a member of one of America's most visible families. The surgery would be secret. It would remain secret for decades, but Freeman would know. He would know that his procedure had been trusted by one of the most powerful men in the country. Freeman wanted this case, and Joe Kennedy wanted what Freeman was selling. Here's the detail that transforms everything: the fact that separates a tragic medical misjudgment from something darker. Rose Kennedy was not told about her husband's plans for their daughter. Joe Kennedy made the decision to have his 23-year-old daughter's brain surgically altered without informing the child's mother. Rose Kennedy, who had carried Rosemary for 9 months, who had given birth to her, who had raised her for 23 years, learned what had been done only after the procedure was completed, only after it was too late. Think about what that secrecy means. Joe Kennedy knew that if he told his wife what he was planning, she might try to stop him. He knew that Rose might object. He knew that the decision he was making could not withstand the scrutiny of people who actually loved Rosemary. So he made sure they couldn't interfere. The alternatives available in 1941 included options far less devastating than lobotomy. Psychiatric care existed. Therapeutic institutionalization existed. Counseling existed. Medication for mood disorders existed. Not the sophisticated pharmaceuticals we have today, but treatments nonetheless. Continued supervision at the convent school remained entirely possible. Family support and environmental modifications could have addressed the behavioral concerns the Kennedys cited. None of these approaches would have permanently destroyed Rosemary's capacity for independent thought. None of them would have silenced her forever. Joe Kennedy chose the option that would. Mid-November 1941, George Washington University Hospital. Rosemary Kennedy, 23 years old, was brought in for a prefrontal lobotomy. The Freeman-Watts protocol for prefrontal lobotomy required the patient to remain conscious. Not fully awake, Rosemary was given mild sedation but conscious, alert enough to respond to questions, alert enough to speak. The theory behind this requirement was that Freeman could monitor the patient's responses as Watts cut into the brain. By asking the patient to perform verbal tasks, Freeman believed he could calibrate the destruction, severing enough tissue to alter behavior while preserving some cognitive function. That was the theory. In practice, it meant that Rosemary Kennedy was awake while doctors destroyed her mind. Watts drilled burr holes into her skull. The sound would have been audible to her. The pressure would have been perceptible. Then Watts inserted a surgical instrument, a slender metal tool designed to reach deep into the brain, and began cutting the connections between Rosemary's frontal lobes and the rest of her mind. While he cut, Freeman talked to her. He asked Rosemary to recite "God Bless America." She did. He asked her to say the Lord's Prayer. She did. He asked her to count backward from 100. She began counting. 99, 98, 97. And while she counted, while she prayed, while she sang, Watts pushed deeper. He cut more tissue. He severed more connections. Rosemary's responses changed. Her voice altered. Its quality shifted, became something different from what it had been moments before. Her words became confused. The counting stopped making sense. Numbers came out of order, or not at all. Her ability to complete the tasks Freeman requested deteriorated progressively. The prayers became fragments. The patriotic song she had been asked to sing faded into sounds that were no longer words. The procedure stopped when Rosemary became incoherent. When the woman who had entered that operating room, capable of conversation, capable of prayer, capable of counting and singing and thinking, could no longer respond in any meaningful way. The surgery had lasted less than an hour. Its effects would last the remaining 63 years of her life. The outcome of Rosemary Kennedy's lobotomy exceeded the worst possibilities the procedure carried. Her ability to walk was severely impaired. The young woman who had danced at social functions, who had been presented at the court of St. James's, who had moved through the world on her own 2 feet, could now barely manage locomotion. Her speech, fully functional before the surgery, was reduced to unintelligible sounds. She could not form coherent sentences. The woman who had written letters and kept diaries could no longer communicate her thoughts to anyone. She could not care for herself. She required assistance with eating, with dressing, with basic bodily functions that any adult should be able to manage. Medical assessments from this period estimated her remaining mental capacity at that of a 2-year-old child. She was 23. Joe Kennedy's response to this catastrophe reveals everything about his priorities, everything about who he really was. He did not acknowledge publicly what had been done. He did not seek accountability from the doctors who had destroyed his daughter. He did not demand answers or explanations or any kind of reckoning for the disaster that had just befallen his eldest daughter. He arranged for Rosemary to be moved far away. Sr.The School for Exceptional Children, Jefferson, Wisconsin, a small town in the upper Midwest, rural and remote. The facility was operated by Catholic sisters who cared for people with developmental disabilities. The location was the point. Jefferson, Wisconsin had no Kennedy family homes nearby. No Boston, no Hyannisport, no Palm Beach. It had no social connections who might recognize a Kennedy daughter and ask questions. It had no journalists who might wonder why one of America's most prominent families had hidden a child in an institution. Rosemary Kennedy would spend more than 50 years at Sr.The. The sisters who cared for her provided round-the-clock care. They fed her, bathed her, dressed her, managed every aspect of her daily existence. They showed her kindness, a kindness her own family largely failed to provide. And what about her siblings? What did John and Bobby and Eunice and Ted know about their sister? They grew up with only the vaguest understanding. They knew they had a sister named Rosemary who was unwell and lived far away. That much was acknowledged. But the details? The truth of what their father had done? The younger Kennedy children were told lies, varying lies, depending on who was asking and when. Rosemary was working as a teacher. Rosemary was mentally disabled and receiving special care. Rosemary preferred privacy. Rosemary was happy where she was. None of these explanations mentioned the lobotomy. None of them mentioned that their father had authorized surgery that destroyed her mind. None of them mentioned that their mother hadn't been consulted. The children accepted what they were told because children trust their parents, and because the alternative that their father had deliberately destroyed their sister was too monstrous to contemplate. Imagine those family dinners. The Kennedy table with its famous competitive energy, its political debates, its preparation of sons for greatness. And somewhere in Wisconsin, a sister they barely remembered. A sister who couldn't hold a fork anymore. A sister who had been erased from the family narrative so completely that her own siblings didn't know she existed in any meaningful way. The silence extended even within the family. Rose Kennedy, who had learned of the lobotomy only after it happened, apparently accepted her husband's decision not to discuss it. She did not tell her children what had been done. She did not visit her daughter for 20 years. Whatever private grief she carried it silently, complicit in the cover-up even if she hadn't been complicit in the original crime. Joe Kennedy never visited his daughter again after placing her at St. Coletta. Never. Not once. Not for the remaining 28 years of his life. The man who had ordered her mind destroyed, who had made the decision, contacted the doctors, arranged the surgery, kept it secret from his wife, simply moved forward with his life. He transferred his political ambitions to his sons. He erased his eldest daughter from the family narrative, as completely as if she had died on that operating table. In the most meaningful sense, she had. The evidence against Freeman and Watts extends beyond their treatment of Rosemary Kennedy. Their own case files told a damning story: patients who had suffered catastrophic outcomes, patients who could no longer function as independent adults, patients whose families had trusted these doctors and received back someone fundamentally diminished. The AMA had warned them. Their own results had warned them. And they proceeded anyway, building a practice that served wealthy families seeking to permanently silence troublesome relatives. The question historians keep returning to is what Freeman and Watts actually knew or suspected about Rosemary Kennedy's condition. Did she meet the standard their own published papers established? Did she suffer from some form of mental disorder requiring the procedure? Or was she simply a young woman with developmental differences and mood challenges, conditions that did not warrant permanent brain damage? The documentary record cannot definitively answer this question. What it can show is that Freeman and Watts performed the procedure on a patient whose father wanted her permanently incapacitated, whose mother wasn't consulted, and whose behavioral issues, sneaking out at night, mood swings, did not meet any reasonable threshold for surgical brain destruction. They knew the risks. They had seen catastrophic outcomes in their own patients. They performed the surgery anyway. What remains unanswered, what historians keep circling back to, is the deeper question of motive. Not the doctor's motive, Joe Kennedy's motive. Some historians have accepted the explanation the Kennedy family eventually offered, that Joe Kennedy was a desperate father seeking help for a daughter whose behavioral challenges had become unmanageable, and that the lobotomy was a tragic miscalculation in an era when such procedures were presented as legitimate medicine. This interpretation treats the decision as misguided but not malicious. A loving father made a terrible mistake. Other historians find this explanation insufficient. They note that the behavioral issues Rosemary exhibited sneaking out at night, mood swings, agitation, did not warrant permanent incapacitation, even by 1941 standards. Thousands of young women in 1941 snuck out at night. Thousands experienced mood swings. These were not conditions that required brain surgery. They note that Joe Kennedy chose doctors known for producing permanently docile patients rather than doctors focused on treatment and recovery. He didn't seek out physicians who might help Rosemary manage her challenges. He sought out physicians who would eliminate the challenges by eliminating her capacity for independent action. They note the secrecy, the speed, the complete exclusion of Rose Kennedy from a decision about her own daughter's medical care. And they note the timing. By 1941, Joe Kennedy's political career was over. His sons were the future now. The family image mattered more than ever, and Rosemary, a young woman who might say inappropriate things, who might behave in ways that embarrassed the family, who might reveal aspects of Kennedy family life that Joe preferred to keep private. Rosemary was a liability. The questions that keep coming up, that historians keep asking even when they can't definitively answer. What exactly was Joe Kennedy afraid Rosemary might reveal? Why the most extreme option? Why the secrecy from her own mother? Why the urgency? The behavioral issues cited as justification do not explain the choice of permanent destruction over less devastating alternatives. The motive remains contested. And it remains contested because the explanation we've been given does not fit the evidence of how this decision was made. Rosemary Kennedy was one victim among thousands. Freeman and Watts performed nearly 100 lobotomies by 1941, and their practice continued after Rosemary. They were not alone. Lobotomy became widespread in American psychiatry during the 1940s and 1950s, with doctors across the country performing the procedure on patients whose families found them difficult to manage. The typical patient wasn't someone with severe, treatment-resistant mental illness requiring radical intervention. The typical patient was someone a family found inconvenient. Women labeled hysterical by husbands who wanted them more manageable. Women labeled promiscuous by fathers who wanted them controlled. Teenagers who were rebellious. Adults whose behavior embarrassed their relatives. People who were difficult. People who asked too many questions. People who wouldn't stay quiet. The consent process for these procedures was minimal to non-existent. Patients were brought to hospitals and subjected to permanent brain damage on the authorization of family members, husbands signing for wives, parents signing for children, relatives signing for anyone they had legal authority over. The patients themselves had no meaningful ability to refuse. They were strapped to tables. They were sedated just enough to keep them still, and they had their brains destroyed based on the signatures of people who wanted them managed rather than helped. If you're watching this, and something in your family history suddenly makes more sense if you're thinking about a grandmother who changed, an aunt who was sent away, a relative whose story was always told in whispers and euphemisms, you're not alone. Freeman and Watts did this to countless families. Walter Freeman kept going after Rosemary Kennedy. The procedure that destroyed her wasn't enough for him. He continued performing lobotomies, continued building his reputation as America's foremost practitioner of surgical brain destruction. But by then, the damage was done. Thousands of patients had been lobotomized. Thousands of families had been destroyed. Joe Kennedy suffered a stroke in December 1961 that left him largely incapacitated for the remaining 8 years of his life. The timing carries its own bitter irony. That same year, 1961, his son John was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. The Kennedy dynasty Joe had spent his life building reached its pinnacle. The son he had groomed, funded, and maneuvered into power was now the most powerful man in the world. While his eldest daughter remained hidden in Wisconsin, unable to speak her own name, unable to recognize the family that had abandoned her, unable to tell anyone what had been done to her, unable to share in the triumph her father had worked so hard to achieve, unable to accuse. Joe Kennedy died in November 1969. He never publicly acknowledged what he had done to his daughter. He never visited her at St. Coletta. He never faced accountability for his decision. He died as the patriarch of an American dynasty, the father of a president, the father of a senator, the grandfather of more politicians to come. His reputation, while complicated, remained that of a successful man who had built something lasting. Rosemary's existence was barely a footnote. The lobotomy remained a family secret for more than 4 decades, protected by wealth, influence, and the silence of everyone who knew. When the truth finally emerged, Joe Kennedy had been dead for years. Walter Freeman had been dead for years. There was no one left to hold accountable. Rose Kennedy eventually began visiting her daughter after that 20-year gap. When she did visit, she found a woman who could barely recognize her, who had no capacity for the conversation or connection that might have existed if the surgery had never occurred, who had spent 2 decades wondering if she could wonder at all anymore why her mother never came. Rosemary Kennedy lived 63 years after the procedure that destroyed her. 63 years in institutions. 63 years without the ability to speak coherently. 63 years erased from the family she was born into. It doesn't change what was done. So what kind of ethics did these men have? Walter Freeman wanted prestige. He wanted to be the father of a medical revolution, the man who cured mental illness with a surgical instrument. He wanted his procedure performed on the most prominent families in America, and he got his wish with Rosemary Kennedy, even if the world wouldn't know about it for decades. He continued performing lobotomies until the medical community finally turned against him. James Watts wanted to be a pioneer. He performed the procedures Freeman designed. He held the instrument that cut into Rosemary Kennedy's brain while she recited prayers and counted backward from 100. He knew the AMA's warnings. He knew the risks from his own case files. He cut anyway. Joe Kennedy wanted control. He had always wanted control over markets, over women, over his family's image, over anything that might threaten the dynasty he was building. And when his eldest daughter became inconvenient, when she exhibited behavior that embarrassed him, when she became a problem rather than an asset, he found doctors willing to solve that problem permanently. He found men who would destroy her mind and call it medicine. None of them faced consequences. Freeman continued his practice until the medical establishment finally rejected him. Watts continued his career. Joe Kennedy continued building his dynasty, watching his sons rise to the presidency and the Senate, while his daughter sat in a Wisconsin institution, unable to speak coherently. And Rosemary Kennedy? She spent the rest of her life silenced, unable to tell anyone what had been done to her, unable to accuse, unable to testify, unable to say her father's name with comprehension, unable to ask why. They silenced her completely, and they got away with it. The verdict, I suspect, you've already reached. But what matters now, what matters more than any judgment we can pass on men who are long dead, is that we remember, that we say her name, that we refuse to let the Kennedy mythology erase what was done to their eldest daughter. Rosemary Kennedy was a person. She kept diaries, she wrote letters. She was presented before the King and Queen of England. She had a life ahead of her. Maybe a complicated life, maybe a life that required support, but a life nonetheless. And on a November morning in 1941, 2 doctors destroyed that life while her father waited, while she prayed, while she counted backward from 100, and her voice grew fainter and more confused until it disappeared entirely. What kind of ethics did these men have? None that deserved the name. If your family has a story like this, if there's someone in your history who was changed, sent away, silenced, know that you're not alone. Freeman and Watts did this to countless families, and for too long, those stories were hidden, buried, treated as shameful secrets rather than crimes that deserved acknowledgement. Rosemary Kennedy couldn't tell her story. Someone should. Subscribe for more stories like this.